you're awake anyway, that's something. Yes?
I actually believe that the inner behavior or the cognition of themselves, of the people in the society, that will change according to the technologies, as you have just mentioned, the surface thing, the surface of the society. And have you evaluated that and just try to give an explanation of the changing deeper behavior and cognition of people?
I almost understand what you're asking, but can you just rephrase it a little bit? Have I looked at
the changing behavior and cognition of people according to the changing society?
Not very systematically, because it's very impressionistic. I mean, I've spent a lot of time studying this village, but when I go to see gurus in London or in towns or cities, I don't really make the same detailed study. So it's just an impression of the way they seem to think and talk and act. So I look at the way that they behave with their children, or their sense of humour, or their attitudes towards money, or just in an impressionistic way. I suspect that there are quite deep changes. They're very, very difficult to measure. For instance, with you lot, I have Chinese students, and they tell me that China is changing so fast that they can't understand people a year younger than themselves. Do any of you have that feeling?
Generation gap.
A sort of generation gap in our culture used to be a generation, i.e. 25 years. In China it's 1 year or 6 months. And what does that mean? When I ask them, well, what do you mean? They say, well, I can't understand their sense of humour. I can't understand anything they're talking about. I can't understand their attitudes. And sometimes I get this when I'm talking about, say, to a girl about some boy who she hopes will be a boyfriend or something. She says, you know, we would like to be boyfriend and girlfriend, but we can't understand each other because he's 2 years older than me. So he doesn't understand anything about me, and I don't understand anything about him, and yet I like him. If you have very rapid, I mean, all technologies and material culture does affect us. So what I was thinking of is, most of you spend most of your time now on the mobile phone.
Yeah.
Natasha is just putting hers down there carefully. But you go to a meal, and in the old days, if you were with Chinese friends, you'd sit round and eat and talk. Now most of them are just sitting talking on their mobile phones. Does this change social interactions and hence mental attitudes among Chinese? I mean, you would understand as well as I do. I suspect it must do. For instance, it means that the group of people around you are not necessarily the people you feel most strongly about or interact with most. You can now interact with a virtual network of people who are nowhere near you, and they are more real than your real friends. Or again, the problem in China is that, which we talked about to many young Chinese, is the relations with their parents' generations. They say they have very bad relations with their parents because their parents can't understand them at all, and they can't understand their parents at all, because their parents grew up in a totally different world of hunger and job insecurity and so on, and they grew up in their current world. So both sides misunderstand each other all the time. So I suspect if I made a deeper study of the gurus in towns and cities, I would find that their mental attitudes and so on are changing. For instance, they spend time with friends who are not gurung and get new attitudes from them. They have different, they're influenced by pop culture and all sorts of things, and by their educational system. But having said all that, also what strikes me about the impressions of spending small periods of time with gurus in cities and so on is that they're very recognisably people I knew in the village as well. We can joke about the same things, but they have the same gentleness of manner, that they are very considerate and kind. And I think, as in the case of Japan, this is not difficult to explain in a way. Most of our character, probably 60, 70%, 80% of our character and personality and mentality is formed by the age of 2 years old. By the time we've learnt language and learnt how to walk and talk and eat and so on, we are who we are. The rest of it is just surface. And the gurungs and the Japanese and no doubt the Chinese have a different way of bringing up children. For instance, gurung children, whether they are in the village or in a city, are brought up with great gentleness. The parents don't hit them. They treat them as reasonable human beings. They talk to them, they explain things. They are very calm and self-confident. So the children grow up like that. They don't fear the world. They see the world as, on the whole, a good place. They trust people. They are trusting. And so this is why they are liked wherever they go, and also are very good at whatever they do, because on the whole, people trust them, people like them, and they are good people to be with. This is my feeling also of the Chinese. I'll end this long answer by saying that when I was with the gurungs, I used to say to my friends, you know, the gurungs are really, really nice people. That's why I like to be with them. They're very honest, sense of humour, strong, kind, so on and so on. The only pity is that there are only 400,000 of them. I wish there were more. And then I came to China, and I found you are all gurungs. On the whole, my experience of Chinese students and people I meet in Sichuan elsewhere is that they're very like. When I saw a photograph of Natasha on the lake in Pokhara, dressed in gurung costume or semi-Nepali costume, she looked exactly like a gurung. And I'm sure she not only looks like a gurung, her character and your character is very like that. Gentle, careful with people, very sensitive, aware of other people's needs, careful with each other, peaceful. And so I found 1.3 billion gurungs living in China.
I have another question.
Yeah.
How would you categorize yourself? Would you just identify yourself as a diffusionist or a structuralist or a functionalist or combined?
As a what or what?
How would you
Diffusionist,
identify yourself?
structuralist, functionalist.
Oh, you mean theoretically?
Yeah.
Well, I'll leave it to others, but I'm a bit like these cultures. I'm layers. That's to say, I was, as I mentioned, my early framework was probably slightly evolutionary, which is the 19th century. I then, no doubt, became a diffusionist, which is the next fashion. I then became a functionalist, which is the next fashion in anthropology. I then became a structural functionalist, which is the next fashion. I then became a Marxist, a materialist, a structuralist, post-structuralist, and a post-post-structuralist. And if you'd like to think of me, here are my evolutionary, my diffusionist, my functionalist. So I'm all of them, as we all are. We don't entirely abandon as cultures don't. We don't abandon the earlier. So for some problems I look at them in functional ways, in others in structural ways, in others in reflexive and postmodernist ways. But what I've learnt, and I may give a lecture about this next year when I come, I was going to give it this year, is, and it's on my website if you're interested, I gave a lecture called the Huxley Lecture, which was called Empire, Modernity and Anthropology, something like that. And what I learnt or talked about there is the fact that all these characterizations, all these pictures of our theoretical frames, none of them remain. They are all ways of trying to understand the world. They are all what some historians of science and others call paradigms. That is, ways of organizing thought, defining the questions you ask and what is an acceptable answer. And if you're interested in all this, then fortunately for you, I've written the first of my master's letters, Meng Yeye's letters to young Chinese, will be out in January, and it's called How Do I Know? Or How Do We Know? Letters to April. And that is a history of theoretical frameworks from the earliest societies up to postmodernism, looking at them as worldviews. I don't think anthropology has any privileged insight into the world. It is part of the wider social sciences, and it has a worldview which it imposes on how it gathers the data and so on. And we live in a particular worldview, and these worldviews are shaped by our context, by the political system around us, by our economic structure, and they change. So 10 years ago, if you'd asked me, I would have given you one answer. Today I'll give you another answer. In another 10 years, if I'm still coming here, still alive, I'll give you another answer. Okay? Other questions? Yes.
Do you think it is actually real possible for people who from different kinds of culture can realize each other? Because, for example, my friend who are studying American said that even they are very good at English, they always misunderstand something that their American friends talk about or something. I think maybe that's a big gap from people from different cultures, and it can't be ignored. How do you think?
Thank you. That's a central problem in anthropology. And I mentioned it in relation to trying to study the life of my sister Dilmaya, trying to bridge the gap between me as a man, her as a woman. Now this is a problem not confined to your friends in America. As I say, you can't understand people 2 years younger than you, or your parents, or someone from, I don't know which part of China you're from. Are you from the south or the north? South. Well, those northerners in China, you know, those people in Beijing, they're crazy, you know. Can't understand what they're about. But we all have that problem with difference. Men can't understand women, old people, young people, and so on. In the case of going to another country, there are two, well, I immediately think of two different kinds of inability to understand. One consists of really rather the surface things. I mean, they might be with a group of Americans and they start talking about something of which your friends have no knowledge. It might be, for example, basketball, or it might be American history. You know, your friends may know nothing about Abraham Lincoln, and if an American says, you know, just as old Abe used to say, who is Abe and what did he say? And what. So this is the content of knowledge. And when you go to a new culture, there's a great deal of local content which either you've got to spend years learning or you will be shut out of the conversations. That content of knowledge applies to us equally. When I spend time with my grandchildren, Lily, half of what she and her sister talk about I don't understand at all. They're talking in a language and about things which I know nothing. This comes out at Christmas when we have a quiz and they set questions, and Sarah and I can't answer any of the questions. who is Goldie Blue Ron? Or what did Madonna wear when she was on the concert at whatever? Completely unknown to us. Likewise, the other way around. If I start talking about William Wordsworth or bits of literature or history that are very well known to Sarah and I, they will know nothing about it. If I said, the Second Reform Act in politics in the 19th century, they wouldn't know what the first or the second or the third or what a Reform Act was or anything else unless they'd done it previously in history. So the content will keep you apart, and you've just got to learn that, and it takes a long time. There may be a deeper structural difference, which is that each different culture thinks differently. The logic of the thinking, which is often in the language itself. For instance, in Japanese, as a language, has many very strange structural features. For instance, you don't have tenses in Japanese. You can't say it happened in the past, it's happening now, it's happening in the future. You can't say that in Japanese. Or in Japanese you can't say yes and no. The same word, hai, means yes and no. So there are features. Now if you come from a language which, for example, doesn't have yes and no and tenses, and you come to a language which has those, can you really understand the other people? There's a famous saying about, the English can't understand the Americans either. There's a famous saying, England and America are countries divided by a common language. That's a joke. You'd think they have a common language. We talk about potatoes, they talk about potatoes. We talk about tomatoes, they talk about tomatoes. But it's the same, tomatoes, tomatoes, and so on. But they don't understand our jokes. Many Americans complain about the British have no sense of humour because they suddenly start laughing at things which are not funny at all. We think the Americans are completely without humour. They don't understand irony and double talk and so on and so on. So even the English and Americans, just with the same language and the same historical background, have difficulty understanding each other. Therefore, it's not surprising that coming from your language system, your Confucian philosophical system, your history, when you go to America, there's a great deal. On the other hand, if you go and settle in America, you have children there, and they start speaking American from very early on, they go to the American schools and so on, they'll have no problems at all. On the other hand, they may have problems when they come back to China. Any other questions?
How do you feel when you come back from your own life from a long time on field work? Do you feel nervous or feel something like unfamiliar with your life you get used to before? That's the question.
When you come back
Yes.
from doing field work, does it feel familiar or?
Yeah. Sarah's translating for me because I'm rather deaf.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right. There was the most famous anthropologist probably in history was a fellow King of my university, and he was totally deaf in his old age. And he used to have a huge ear trumpet. And so his wife, acting as Sarah, used to come in and say, "Professor X has come to see you!" shouting into his ear trumpet. Sarah doesn't have to do this.
Yes.
Yet. I have a little expensive gadget, but I haven't put it in today. Yes, I mean, I was trying to say that in earlier. Your own culture becomes unfamiliar and strange when you come back. And this is, in fact, what I think is one of the important features of anthropology. People sometimes say that the task of anthropology is to make the unfamiliar familiar and the familiar unfamiliar. So you go to another society and it's all strange, you don't understand it at all. And over your studies it becomes understandable and familiar. But its other task is to make familiar everything you take for granted unfamiliar. So when I come to China now, although it's not such a great cultural shock as this, when Sarah and I go back to England, for a few days, things will seem very strange. You know, why can't they have decent food in this country? Why do they wear clothes like this and so on? Gradually, after a few days, you get back to it. Another thing that happens is that, as I mentioned, the pattern of your life is disturbed, and therefore when we go back, I know there'll be not only some shock from travelling long distances by air, but also nothing will mean anything. All sorts of things you thought were terribly important and you were busy with before you left, you go back and what's the point? Why do it? It takes 3 or 4 days before you get back into the rhythm, as it were. But anthropology should constantly shock you. When I teach undergraduates and so on, I say that the whole point of anthropology is to make you examine who you are and the deeper aspects of your life. Things you just took for granted about your life, you should start to question and reassess. So anthropology is part of growing older and becoming self-aware and reflecting on yourself by going there and looking back on your own culture. There's a saying by a historian, "He who only England knows does not know England." If you only know your own culture, if you've never been abroad, you won't understand your own culture either. Okay? You have a
Yeah, my topic is also about culture shock when you come back, you know. To some degree, I think culture shock can help you to write, you know. You miss that place and you keep memorizing the life when you're there, and maybe it's helpful to some degree.
You mean the reverse culture shock?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting idea. But I think that probably is true, that you can't write about anything that is too familiar and you are too close to. So the fact that when you come back, your own culture is strange and you have a shock at encountering it again is one of the background encouragements or enabling features of being able to write about the other. I didn't actually talk about this, but you find yourself in a very difficult position in that period because you are in two places at the same time. Your head and your heart are where you've been doing field work. Your body and practical life is in your where you have returned to. And that tension between the two also helps you to write because you are trying to explore that difference. It's a well-known fact that nearly all great discoveries are made on the boundary or border, particularly between cultural systems. the greatest writers like Alexis de Tocqueville or Adam Smith or Max Weber, they all worked with one foot in one culture, one foot in another culture. And anthropologists do this. I mean, talking in quite general and ideal terms, many anthropologists do very sort of humble things. They go to one factory, and they spend 2 years in a factory, and they come back and they write a description of that factory. The kind of anthropology I was trained in, and I think is the kind I like, is asking very big questions about what it is to be human, looking at all kinds of different civilizations and societies and trying to come up with answers to the big questions. The great period of anthropology in which I was trained, the anthropologists were world thinkers. There is a danger, and it happens in anthropology as everything else, that the great discoveries are made and then people start filling in smaller and smaller and smaller things. So keep your ideas open and aim high. Okay?
Thank you.
So one more question, anyone? Yeah.
In your film, yesterday I saw your teacher video sing a song and watch your children's head. I want to know, when you do that, do this have any effect on their original culture and your research? Because I have heard that when you're in the field, you should understand and respect their original culture and don't change it. So I want to know, do that have any effect on your research?
This is the effect of me singing
Elvis Presley.
Elvis Presley. Well, it was part of what I was talking about there. When I first went, and many anthropologists said, you know, don't disturb the culture. Don't bring in a plastic bucket. Don't bring in a radio. Don't bring in your own songs and your own culture. And I think, to a certain extent, in the early days of anthropology, there was some justification for that. For instance, if you were going to a very remote tribal group in South America, in the forests of Amazonia, or you were going to some very remote island in the Pacific, and the people had a very ancient and integrated system, and you just came in and you gave all the children sweets, and you handed out pop songs, and you encouraged them to go to the equivalent of McDonald's and so on. You could very easily upset, destroy, undermine in a very small community. Someone coming in with money and goods could. By the time I was going to do fieldwork, that world was already changing. And certainly what I noticed in the village was that this was happening all the time, because people were going to the army, they were going to Britain, they were going to Singapore, coming back with radios and buckets and songs, and they were changing their own society. So why should I be particularly careful? Because I wouldn't have much effect anyway, and I would have no more effect than the sort of soldiers returning from the army. And the other realization is that societies will change anyway, whether you sing Elvis Presley songs to them or not. So we don't really now have to be so cautious. This was 30, 40 years ago. Now the situation is far further on, because most of the villages here have mobile phones. Many of them have satellite television sets. So if they want to watch someone singing Elvis Presley, they'll watch Elvis Presley. They won't come and listen to me anyway. There's little I could do, either to increase or decrease the rate of change in these societies. I think this will be the case with most of you. On the other hand, be sensitive and careful when you go to a culture. There's no point in making them feel backward by flashing modern consumer goods in their faces which they can't afford, etc. In fact, the situation has changed so much. If in the old days an anthropologist would come to China and they might be a wealthy Westerner who would feel that they shouldn't show off all their wealth or change Chinese culture. Sarah and I now come as poor Westerners and drive around in your wonderful cars. And you have two cars. We only have one car, and our car is half the size of all your cars. So you are much richer than we are. And so the situation has been reversed, and that's true in many parts of the world. Okay? So I think on that point, it's 3 o'clock, and you've got all those exciting things to do outside. So thank you very much for coming, and maybe see you tomorrow.